Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jared Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum.
Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, and I'm excited this week to welcome back probably one of our first podcast guests back in the day when we started Podcast on the Brink. The great Chronic Hoosier is here to join us from his bunker in Bloomington. How's it going, Chronic?
I am so happy to be back, man. It's good to be back. It's good to be talking about basketball and football and actual college sports again. It's just good to be talking. I mean, it's good to be back together as kind of in this community that it's created. I talked about it in The Athletic. It's just something that's so special to me and so many folks I know. And it's been a dark period this summer without any certainty whether or not we're going to have a season. If we do, when it's going to start, what it's going to look like. It's been an off season, obviously, unlike anything else we've had to this point. But here we are with a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. So it's good to have a distraction that we can all get behind again.
For those who aren't familiar with what Chronic just mentioned, The Athletic recently, Eamon Brennan, who some of you may or may not know, helped co-found Inside the Hall back in 2007, looked at, I believe it was 10 kind of under-the-radar college basketball Twitter accounts that people should follow. And Chronic, you were one of the 10 that was featured in the article. What was it like for you getting that I guess that recognition and being selected to be in that piece?
It was a mad search for Wi-Fi. Eamon had reached out to me when we were vacationing as fall break here in Bloomington, at least for the community schools. So we took a quick dip down to a beach house in Cape San Blas, Florida, kind of the elbow of the Panhandle. Real remote, real chill, but really not great for Wi-Fi connectivity. And the place we had rented was brand new construction. One of the properties, the entire area actually just got leveled and rebuilt following Michael. And place was amazing, except the connection was trash. So I got the message on my phone when I was making a run for some seafood from the shrimp company just down the road from us. And I was super stoked about it. And I was trying to, put together some answers, and I pulled out my laptop and realized connectivity is really not a good option here. So I had to pick a time where I could, get some connectivity, went in town, grabbed a coffee, sat at the cafe, and was able to punch out some answers. It was wild, man, because for me, at least, the retrospective component of it, whenever people ask me, why do you do it? Or how did this happen? I really don't have a good answer. But in trying to backtrack it, when this whole thing was first starting up and Inside the Hall was just being born, I had just become, pretty thoroughly infatuated with all these awesome newly emergent blogs that were popping up everywhere and these perspectives that you didn't find back then. The news sites were just coming online at that point, with, pretty good prevalence. But it was still the same thing everywhere you went, with just changes of verbiage and the angles and the looks and, some of the controversies that were popping up all over when now everybody's publishing. And it was fascinating to me. And, I was reading the Postman. Somebody had just tipped me off to him. Deadspin had just come out. There was so much that was just absolutely enthralling. And I started commenting on it. And, first I started reading the comment section, which was wild. It was a little tamer version of what you were getting on the message boards. But it also put a premium on the people that were running those communities, that were kind of curating those environments. And, between the guys over at the Herald Times, you with Inside the Hall, Zach Osterman, I think he was with, 24/7, or he was with some of the other publications right then. But everybody was kind of doing their own thing. And while there were a lot of the same voices and there were concentric circles, it gave everybody an opportunity to kind of create their own niche in the market and their own voice. And, it provided a lot of awesome opportunities. Got the chance to meet you. One of my greatest regrets this year as we head into this basketball season, we never got a chance to do the Hysteria podcast. And that was always one of the highlights of my calendar, just to get everybody back together, to get back to Assembly Hall. Just all the hope, the promise, the anticipation of what was to come. But more than anything for me, the community that it created. So really fortunate for that. Really sad that we're not going to have the in-person component of it this year. But at the end of the day, I'm glad we get to come back together kind of in the space here where it all began and reconnect and hopefully have some positive developments to look forward to in the future with IU basketball.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, as somebody who, to my knowledge, like in terms of IU, definitely fan accounts, but even looking at some of the follower accounts on the IU Mediascape, I mean, you've got I think over 40,000 Twitter followers. How have you seen kind of Twitter change since you started running your account back in the day? To me, it seems obviously there's obviously a lot more people on there, but to me, kind of in the last couple of years and maybe even back before that, just the tone of some of the responses and things has changed dramatically. It seems like in the beginning it was more of an information kind of sharing service, and then you had, accounts like yours that were meant for entertainn't a lot of times, but now it almost seems like everything's kind of blurred together, and there's to me just kind of I've told people privately that sometimes I don't read my replies and things like that just because of the general nastiness of the platform. Do you agree that it's kind of changed, and what specifically do you kind of attribute that to?
It was funny as I was kind of going back through everything in my mind, responding to that article. It was so much more enjoyable back then. I mean, I had instantly gravitated towards it because it was a single site where you could get all your favorite links and all your favorite writers kind of aggregated. And it was awesome because, instead of having to visit 30, 40 different web pages throughout the day, you got to kind of custom curate your own list and who you wanted to follow and what conversations you wanted to be a part of. And I felt like early on, obviously the community was a little bit smaller. I think it tended to represent those that were a little more invested in it, or at least, kind of self-filtering those that were a little more technical or technologically savvy. But it was a lot more positive, I felt like. And certainly there was a divergence of opinions. And I think that's kind of where my voice stood out because I like to make fun of things, and, point out ridiculousness. And there was a whole lot of it going on back then. At the end of the Greenspan era, coming into the Crean era and all that. IU was in a weird place at the time. And I think that IU BB community kind of reflected and at least was pragmatic enough to acknowledge where we were, where we've been, why we got there. But it was certainly a lot more civil conversations that were taking place. Not unlike the broader community. I feel like it's gotten extraordinarily more divisive. It's gotten really, really toxic. The way people want to shout you down and, everybody, it's just like you're instantly nuclear anytime you see an opinion that you disagree with. And, I've never really put a whole lot of stock in my mentions because quite honestly, whatever I say to provoke them is probably not worthy of response. But it's been difficult for me this summer just because, obviously there's still a lot of lingering frustration with IU not officially making the tournament, though I still very much feel like Archie had a tournament team. You had that going on in this world. And then in the bigger world, the bottom kind of fell out when COVID set in and, it kind of put everything on ice for several months and it left a lot of people, in a really vulnerable spot, economically, emotionally, psychologically, physically with their health. And, it got really, really weird this summer to the point that I spent the bulk of the off season. I rearranged my home screen. There were a couple of times where I just took all social media off my phone for a week, or two even. I've turned my mentions off, for the better part of the last half a year. Just because anytime you say anything, it's just a fire hose of toxicity, and it's not healthy. But at the end of the day too, and one thing I realized, there's a very much part of me that misses the constructive, the civil parts of the conversations, even when we're disagreeing. Those who can still do it without being disagreeable. I think that's the better of us. Unfortunately, while those voices are probably in the majority, it tends to be, the small minority that just really makes it not a very fun place to be. I'm fortunate that I just go there as a hobby, basically by choice. I can't imagine. I really feel for a lot of my friends, yourself included. I see some of the replies, and it's not worth it. I mean, it's not worth trying, going out of your way to try and ruin somebody's day just because you disagree with something they may have said. At the end of the day, there are far, far bigger things going on in our lives than, whether or not this decision or that tactically in sports was wise or whatnot. But I don't know, man, the block button has become my friend. I'll say that much.
Yeah, I like to sometimes take a step back from it and remind myself that it's not necessarily reflective of the whole IU community or the whole IU basketball community as a whole. You're always going to have kind of extreme points of view or different things like that they're going to be amplified by a platform. And I think that's kind of one of the unfortunate things that we've kind of lost, as you mentioned, from the beginning, the early days. I remember reading the comments on like the Hoosier Scoop blog and even the comments on Inside the Hall. They've changed dramatically over the year, just kind of the tone and things like that. And, as someone that publishes content, I don't really know that there's a right answer to any of this. We're all learning on the fly, and I'm sure Twitter is doing its best to try to make things better. But at some point, it gets to be such a problem that I don't know that there's a quick fix. You just have to hope over time that we kind of move back to kind of the smaller community type feel, but I don't know if that's going to happen. But one thing, I do want to talk to you a lot about IU basketball today, but one thing that, and this is funny that I mentioned this, I put out, a question on Twitter to readers, if they had anything to ask you specifically. And as we sit here and criticize Twitter for the last 5 minutes, I use it to get questions for this podcast. But I'm just curious, as you're somebody who lives and breathes all 24 IU sports. You've supported all of them in various ways over the years. I've seen you tweet just about every sport. And so IU football's win over the weekend over Penn State. I don't write about football. I watch it casually. I can't say that I'm invested in it as much as you are, but it was obviously a cool moment for the program to, as someone who's, as I mentioned, watched casually over the years. Indiana's been close so many times in big games, and to finally see them get over the hump, I was just happy to see that for the players, for someone like Scott Dolson, who's obviously been at IU for a long time. Tom Allen's done a great job, all the coaches and staff. What was your reaction to that moment, and kind of where does it rank for you in terms of IU football moments since you've been following the team?
I'm still in disbelief, to be totally honest with you. It still feels surreal, now 72 hours outside of it. It's one of those things where learned behaviors have just become so ingrained in our minds and in our psyches. Indiana football, always a bridesmaid, never a bride when it comes to the big games, particularly against the opponents in the Big Ten East. And, to see for so many years a program that's just been so close and never able to get over the hump. It's actually fascinating that they've been able to find themselves in the losing end of all those games. Eventually the law of averages says you're going to get a break somewhere. Whether it be just dumb luck, Big Ten officiating, combination of all the above, it just never seemed to work out. And, this was one of those just prototypical or stereotypical, this is how an IU game goes. They take a commanding lead in the second and they carry it for the entire third quarter, and then they let it slip away in the fourth. And, it's another heartbreaking loss on national television to a ranked opponent. And, despite everything shaping up to produce exactly that same outcome, it's like they had to wait till it was the most improbable, 0.1% chance of victory when they got the ball back that final time in regulation. And they made it happen. So, of course, how else is Indiana going to finally break that streak other than in literally the most ridiculous way possible? I tweeted it after the game. I still feel today, this was a watch shot moment for the team. And it's a moment that they haven't had in decades, like quite literally decades. They're all over SportsCenter. All the major national outlets are covering it. You've got Tiger Woods looking at replays as he's on the, approaching the tee box. I mean, when has Tiger Woods ever given a crap about Indiana football? And here we are, man. This is 2020. I'm just tremendously happy for the players, for the staff, for the entire administration. For years they've taken just an absolute beating online everywhere, basically, for just for their failures, their inabilities to get over that hump. And I've said all along that it's going to be a question of leadership. Obviously, talent goes a whole long way on the football field, but ultimately it took Tom Allen convincing them that they could do it. Having trust in each other, having that belief that if they followed his guidance, that good things were going to come. And we saw that come to fruition with last year's season. Still really, really unfortunate they weren't able to pull off the Gator Bowl win. But more than anything, I'm just tickled pink that they were able to sustain that momentum from last January throughout this crazy offseason and all the delays that were baked into it. And they finally got the reward for all they've invested in the program. And I'm happy for all my friends that have been there with me throughout all of this. That have had all those shared experiences. It just feels really good to see them have that cathartic moment as well. You saw Galen on his floor. IU football even tweeted that one out. That absolutely killed me. I'm just glad that Stewart didn't mount him. That would have absolutely destroyed his online career for the rest of his life if his dog would have started going to town on him. But that was, I said it then, he was everybody, just that emotional release to see it finally happen. I can't say there's been anything close to that for IU football in my lifetime. And that's coming from a guy that grew up going over, we had season tickets during the Bill Mallory years. I'm used to watching IU football win a good amount of games, more games than they lost, regular bowl participants. So to get the opportunity to share that again with my kids, with my friends, with my family, it's a pretty cool feeling. Yeah, we should stick around.
You mentioned something earlier that kind of caught my attention about basketball. You said Indiana would have made the tournament last year, but obviously they technically did not because there was no tournament to be played. And so, this has been a frequent topic of conversation on the show. A couple weeks ago, Scott from Crimson Cast was on. I talked to him about this. I've talked to various other people throughout the offseason. This is kind of, I feel like, a pivotal time for IU basketball right now. We've got year 4 of the Archie Miller era getting ready to get started. We have no idea what it's going to look like. We don't know a schedule. We're less than, actually 4 weeks from today is supposed to be the first day of competition for college basketball. We have no idea who IU's playing on that first day, if they're playing that first day. We've got 3 seasons that I think for the most part, most people would characterize as underwhelming in terms of the results, especially the second season where there were a ton of expectations and obviously the talent to do more than what was done. Where are you kind of right now with the state of the program as Archie enters his 4th season? What do you need to see this year to feel like things are progressing and going in the right direction?
I very much don't believe that Archie's career at IU, is going to be made or broken by the outcome this season. But I very much feel like he's kind of setting the table for that contract year. I've tried to preach patience with myself and to others for the last several years as the results have been disappointing. That, you need to give him the time to construct the roster the way he wants it to be, to fit his system, to get his guys in there. To let his staff develop them and, to really hone the features and the skills that they're most prioritizing with them. And it's not been an easy ride. It's not been easy to remain patient throughout this because, obviously we want results now, every year. So, there's always 1 or 2 examples where you can point to a coaching change, or a recruit and say, it turned there. They were able to turn it around right there. Why can't you do that? This has been a program that has remained incredibly well resourced. compared to pretty much any other school in the nation. It's not for lack of resources. It's not for lack of money. It's not for lack of a lot of things. But for the fact that, it takes time to build culture. It takes time to build a program. It takes time to get guys to a position where you want them, where they're capable of delivering what you expect from them. And at the end of the day, we talk about talent in football. It's obviously important in every sport, but when you're talking about a team sport that only has 5 players on the floor at any given time, it just puts a magnifying glass on your recruiting, on your development. And I do think that Archie deserves time to build the roster, to build the program to a place where he wants it to be. I guess my big concern right now is as you look at that development from a program level standpoint, what is this program's identity heading into year 4? What are the emphases on offense, defense philosophies? What are the standards that he's holding these guys to? And I think there's been some clarity that's kind of grown in that space, but I think there's still a lot more to be answered here. And quite frankly, I think this is a year where it's fair to start asking some more pointed questions about those topics. Obviously there's still some carryover on the roster, but this is, for better or worse, this is Archie's team now, in my estimation. These are his recruits, for the most part. The Tom Crean era is basically officially done in Bloomington, as far as his holdouts and leftovers. And I think it's time that we look at it pragmatically, that we look at it with clear eyes, that, we start to see some improvement. And I think first and foremost, I'm still waiting to see an offense that's competent and capable of scoring the ball at a higher level than we've seen so far. And, I think Archie has long been known as a defensive mind. But obviously there's got to be some balance there. And, I'm really excited this year to see what the offense looks like. You've got a really skilled guard in Rob Finnessy coming in, and a heck of an understudy in Christian Lander. And I've always felt like for Archie's offense, that was going to be kind of the linchpin from it. This was a guy that was a undersized point guard, played in a really tough league, both, in prep as well as in college. The only way you get to the level he did, as a player is, you got to be really, really sharp. You got to be really disciplined. You got to be able to execute the game plan. And you've got the feeling throughout that that's the expectation he set from his guards. Now it's time to see if they can, how close they can come to fulfilling that expectation. And then, what complementary pieces go around it? How do they interact? How do they engage? What type of chemistry can they achieve? This is going to be a big year for me, at least as far as answering some of those broader level, program level questions.
It's interesting that you bring up the offense because, and obviously I don't want to compare this to Crean at all because it's a different coaching staff, it's different players, but I kind of feel like we're in the same spot just in terms of the discussions that we're having with the offense now that we were under Crean under the defense, right? It was these Crean teams, they would come out on a Sunday afternoon and play Ohio State or Illinois at Assembly Hall and make 18 threes and blow them off the court. And it was a fun thing to watch. But then they would turn around and they would go on the road and threes weren't falling and they couldn't guard and they would lose the road games. Now it feels like the exact opposite thing is happening, whereas Indiana can defend at a level that is good enough to win, but the offense, something just seems to be lacking. To me, it's a lot of it is a recruiting issue with not having the shooters in there that need to be. What have you seen offensively, kind of the first 3 seasons that encourages you, if there is anything? And what do you think needs to change as we kind of enter year 4? I don't think Indiana's maybe ever going to be that explosive offense that we saw under Crean. It just needs to get to the level I feel like where it's solid, and then you can grit out those games where you are playing really well defensively. But if you can't score, I think there was 2 games last year on the road in the Big Ten where they scored 50 points and 49 points. You're just not going to beat very many teams with that type of offensive output.
No, this was a team that put up 50 points in Piscataway. Rutgers, for all places. It's just that's not sustainable. 49 at Penn State, not sustainable. 49 at West Lafayette, not sustainable. I felt like the way that Archie is trying to build this thing, obviously you've got to feel confident in his ability to recruit. 3 3 Indiana Mr. Basketball winners in a row is unprecedented at IU. It's no small feat by any means. I think one of his biggest shortcomings so far has been his experience, the on-floor leadership. And that's certainly something that, I look to see some market improvement on. But the way that he's probably most likely to succeed isn't with the 5 stars as much as it's with a deep and experienced cast of supporting 3 and 4 star players that know the system, that buy into their roles, that are able to execute them at a really high level. And I think a lot of times, as you've gone back and looked at some of the games, you get the sense that, when the ball's moving, the offense creates a decent amount of looks. I mean, I feel like for the last couple of years, it's not been for lack of game planning as much as it's just been having somebody out there that's got the confidence in themselves or the confidence in their teammates to pull the trigger. The looks seem to be there. You just yet to see that guy emerge, or guys, more favorably, that are willing to spot up and let it rip when they've got the shot, rather than continuing to move the ball, or rather than continuing trying to feed it inside when they kick it out. In today's game, when you get an open look, I don't care who's on the floor. You've got to have guys that you're comfortable taking it, whether it's a 3-point shot, whether it's a spot up from the corner, or from the elbow for that matter. If the shot's there, you got to take it in the offense. And I feel like the offense, when it's executing, moving the ball around the perimeter, when they're able to play inside out, I think that's one thing Trace Jackson has been a tremendous asset for. He really opens up so much of that game from an inside out standpoint. He just gives you a lot of options, and he's proven to be a pretty capable playmaker in his own right. I'm really looking forward to see if the wings on this team are going to be able and willing and capable of stepping up when the ball gets in their hand and the look is there. Because quite honestly, if you're not capitalizing on what it's given you, or even willing to attempt it, what's the point in running it? Or at least what's the point in having that guy on the floor? And that's one thing that's kind of concerning this year is, as you spread that demand out, you're looking at, particularly or specifically me, I'm looking at Rob Finney being more willing to take a more assertive role in the offense, looking for some of the younger guards, Anthony Leal, Trey Galloway, and their ability to step up and contribute. And we talk about shooting. Part of it too is going to be their ability to drive and get to the rack and to penetrate and get defenses collapsed, because that opens up so much else on the perimeter. And quite honestly, I think it's so much of what the offense has been missing, quite frankly, just boils down to guard play. And, we've kind of got a sense that Archie didn't really trust his guards, at least not entirely, up until this point. And that's one thing that, he's got to get to a point, I think, where he has faith in them and they have trust that he's going to leave them out there if they take the risks. Because honestly, he's not always shown the longest leash or the greatest patience when it comes to some of the decisions that the guards have made, and justifiably so, to be totally honest.
I think another interesting just kind of conundrum he has going into the season is how he handles the front court rotation, because last season when he played Brink and Jackson Davis and Smith together, and really it really limited what they could do offensively. And this year, I feel like with Smith leaving, he has an opportunity to kind of redefine how he's going to, manage the offense and manage the rotations and the lineups. I still would like to see, and I don't know that this is going to happen with any regularity, I still would like to see a situation where Trace is playing the 5 at times, and you've got 4 players around him that can space the floor a little bit and kind of open things up. Because when they go with a 2 big set and you're not going to let Trace shoot outside of 5 or 6 feet, it still makes it pretty easy for the defense to just focus kind of on the inside. And then, when you've got guys shooting mid-30s to some guys down to the 20s from the 3-point line, you're going to let guys have looks from the outside when the other option is, letting Trace get an easy 2. How do you foresee this front court kind of being structured this season? Do you think it's going to be a situation where he's going to go with Jackson Davis and Brink again to start, and then make adjustments as it goes? Would you like to see Trace and Race maybe playing together more often, or Trace at the 5 with Jerome Hunter at the 4? I mean, I feel like Smith leaving kind of opens the door, because, if Justin Smith comes back, I think the expectation, he was a 3-year starter, he's going to start again, right? Mm-hmm. Him leaving, I think, kind of opens things up for Archie to maybe make some changes. And I think, in some ways it does need to happen, because if you're going to go with 3 guys at a time that can't shoot from the perimeter, you're real easy to guard.
No, absolutely. And, the Justin Smith departure is, it may be a little bit of a blessing and a curse for Archie. I think it does open up a lot of different lineup combinations. It does kind of make them inclined to play a little bit smaller. I mean, Joey Brunk's the only player on the team taller than 6'11", at least according to IU stats. I think Trace is probably going to spend a decent amount of time at the 5 this year. I think there's going to be a tremendous burden, or at least ask, of Race Thompson to really step up and contribute. All accounts this offseason, he's really stepped forward as a leader. This is, I think, where that redshirt year just pays off in spades for both Race as well as for the entire staff, to be totally honest with you, especially when you add in the injuries that he had getting to this point after the redshirt season. He's just a guy that brings a lot of time, at least on campus and within the system, maybe without all the minutes to back it up. But it's going to be fascinating to me to see how they do choose to play that, because, there's certainly going to be some tough decisions at the front court, not just in how you build it, but how do you protect it? If offenses really want to attack inside, it just opens up IU to some vulnerabilities from a defensive standpoint. If Trace takes 2 fouls in the first half, at that point you're riding Joey and Race pretty much exclusively until the break, and for possibly some time late in the second. So it's going to put a premium on intelligent big guy play. I think it is going to open up be more of a wing driven team. I think you're going to have a lot of mismatches. They're going to get created out of it. And, whenever you're doing that, it just really puts a premium on the tactics, because those mismatches go on both sides of the floor. And, I was just talking yesterday with a good friend of mine, and looking at this season, but prospectively down the road as well. That's one area that doesn't seem to be getting a whole lot of attention, at least on the recruiting front. But what happens if, with Trace Jackson Davis just getting named second team All-American yesterday, if his season goes as planned, there's a very realistic chance that, he may be 2 and through at Indiana. Or at least it's something that you have to prepare for that contingency. And, imagining what this roster would look like without his presence on there gets really scary really quickly, to be totally honest with you. And there's certainly the risk that, something can pop up throughout the season. And that's one thing that, as we've seen, we saw it last night, even right up to the very end of the World Series, COVID is going to rear its head at any point, probably often, probably dramatically. Look at what's happening with the Wisconsin football team right now, and how it's totally turning their hopes and prospects on this year. So, fingers crossed that the guys are able to keep everything together from a health standpoint. One of the things that's kind of been a point of concern in all sports up to this point, because of all this disruptions in the normal cycle of the off season and the camps, just non-COVID related issues, health issues, seem to be a big point of concern. So hopefully, the strength and conditioning staff with Cliff Marshall and Tim Garl has got the bodies right. Because it's not been a normal year as that goes as well. There have been some shutdowns across the IU athletics campus that have caused them to hit pause on the off-season conditioning. Things have been fairly good, to the best of my knowledge, since they came back and class is officially in session. The one thing I think that basketball has to look forward to is they're going to spend the bulk of the season without students on campus. So it's going to be a far more controlled environment as they're going through most of that, without most of the IU students, or, Big Ten wide. They're basically going to be able to create their own de facto bubbles. So hopefully that enables them to keep stuff together. But, more than anything, there's a lot of potential on the IU roster, but there's also a lot of potential pitfalls as well, because it's only going to take a couple of episodes where things can get real screwy in a hurry. And, I think you can extrapolate that and say the same thing for leadership as well. There's a lot of guys that are being pegged to take on roles they haven't previously performed on the team. Obviously, they've selected these captains for that very reason. Now they got to live up to it, though, at the end of the day, and they got to be able to perform. They got to be able, more than anything, to lead their teammates by example. But as we enter this year 4 of Archie's tenure. I do feel like from a developmental standpoint, as you watch these guys individually progress, Joey, since he's come to campus, Rob, Race, I feel like they're in a position where they're ready to assume that mantle. It's not something that's just being placed upon them.
So as we sit here 28 days before the season's scheduled to begin, we don't have a schedule. And over the summer, I was optimistic that college basketball was going to not repeat the same mistake that college football made, and just hoping that this pandemic was going to go away. It seemed like in many ways that football made a ton of mistakes in terms of figuring out logistics for the season, waiting to the last minute. And the end result there was obviously the Big Ten having to, delay its season, cancel its season, and reinstate the season. And just from a PR perspective, it was a complete nightmare. And I thought that with college basketball having so much more time to plan, that there would be a more concrete plan. And that's what Dan Gavitt, if you watched any of the content over the summer on the NCAA's Twitter account, Andy Katz interviewed him numerous times. There was numerous coaches and people involved at the higher levels of college basketball talking about how time was on their side. There was going to be a plan for everything. We're considering all these contingencies, which brings me to earlier this week. All of these multi-team events that were scheduled to be played in Orlando at Disney are now not going to be played. And am I crazy to say that college basketball didn't learn anything from college football? Because at this point, it seems like there should be a little bit more clarity on how the season's going to work. You've got speculation now coming out from national reporters that some leagues are looking at going to a conference-only schedule. I know that there's, from the NCAA perspective, they run the tournament, but they don't run the regular season in terms of what the conferences do. So there's going to be differing opinions on testing and things like that throughout the country. But it really feels like college basketball is in the same spot that football was, in that we don't have any consensus on how the season's going to work. To me, it's crazy that we're 4 weeks away from the season. We have no schedule. And do you agree with me that we're kind of in a less than ideal spot with less than a month to go before the season tips off?
I think that's probably an understatement at this point. It has magnified the absence of centralized leadership across the sport. You saw it early on in football. A lot of the conferences kind of operating on their own, freestyling basically, and the divisions that appeared there. It very much appears to have spilled over into basketball. It very much, I think, is still, rooted in the same reasons. Testing, what are the protocols, and no differently than how football kind of navigated those issues. Basketball still struggles because there's not been a lot of clarity, because situations remain so incredibly fluid, because supply chains remain just incomprehensibly disjointed and broken and unreliable. One of the things the Big Ten has done in providing their own testing and basically taking that component of it over, so there's at least uniformity as far as how all the teams are going to be tested and what the protocols are going to be whenever tests come back, positive and whatnot. But at the end of the day, I think this is the expected result whenever you have all these independent agencies kind of operating under their own guidelines, their own priorities. It's just made for an absolute mess of it. But at the end of the day, I mean, that's kind of like our national picture as well. I'm not by any means trying to get political here, but when you have no coordinated, encompassing strategy, you end up with all these different plans and all these different conflicts. And, I think until they ever got to a point where they're able to reconcile that, at least even just best practices and standards, not to mention, suppliers and protocols for what happens after this or that happens. This is always going to happen. And I don't know what they expected to change. I feel like for much of this, the conferences, the national leadership, they've just kind of been waiting with bated breath to see what happens next that makes everything great. And, lo and behold, here we are, 7 months and some change after we last watched a basketball game in Banker's life, and we still have no clarity. We still have no plan. We still have no coordinated efforts. I'm dealing with this on a personal level right now. We had an issue at work yesterday, and you've got 112 people all scrambling, trying to find their own testing. Because there is no centralized place you can go. And it's designed to create these chaotic situations, if you will. Honestly, I'm still kind of at a loss why they couldn't agree upon a certain set of standards, a set of protocols, even if it's not all encompassing of entire conferences, why they couldn't agree upon those contractually with individual opponents. Why they couldn't coordinate this, because at the end of the day, they had the advantage of time. They had the advantage of perspective, watching everybody else fail and, find successes where they could. I've yet to see any evidence that they've really learned from them, other than that there's evidence that, despite your best efforts, there's still going to be all sorts of risks. There's still going to be contaminations. There's going to be, breaches in your protocols, that you're going to have to roll with. And, if anything, they've just learned that short of a complete bubble, there's no easy way to do any type of organized sports in a pandemic right now in a way that keeps all the administrators and all the participants safe to agree that they're comfortable with. And I think they're going to continue to do that until we at least have some baseline that conferences, that teams, that schools can get behind. So I would not be surprised if we end up conference only, or maybe just a smattering of non-conference games. But at the end of the day, it is extremely troubling. It's disappointing and concerning that here we are, a couple of days away from November, and we still have no idea when we can expect to see teams resume competition.
Yeah, this would be I think a PR hit from a national perspective, from a lot of the voices out there. But if I'm a major conference, and I'm talking, the 5 or 6 major conferences, I'm a commissioner of one of those leagues right now. I'm saying we're going conference only. If you're the Big Ten right now, you're expected to have the best, if maybe it won't be the best, but one of the top 2 leagues in the country this year. What's the upside for the Big Ten right now to play non-conference games? If they could put together a 24 or 26 game conference only schedule, you're going to give all of your schools in your league a chance to make the tournament by playing that schedule. People, if that happens, you're going to have certain voices saying, well, you didn't give the mid majors or the low majors a chance, but you know what? This is a once in a lifetime, hopefully, situation. And if they want to get a season done, there has to be uniform protocols for all the schools that are participating. That's why it makes no sense for Indiana to play out of conference games if the schools that they're playing aren't following the same protocols. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you think it's something? Do you think from a PR perspective that the major conferences should even care at this point, or should their focus be on just getting a season in? Because ultimately, if you go out of conference and you're playing teams from other conferences without the same protocols, and you get a breakout, then you're just going to end up stopping your season for an indefinite period of time. So if that can't be agreed upon, I don't see a reason for an Indiana or an Ohio State or any major conference team that could do daily testing to go outside the league and play games.
This is one of those situations too, where as you look across the national and the conference landscape, where you get to a point of the haves and the have-nots. The Big Ten stepping up and taking over responsibility and cost accountability for a testing protocol is something that, a lot of conferences or schools on the individual level just don't have the resources to manage. There are plenty of them that have the resources, but just don't have the supply availability because of the region where they exist. The way in which testing continues to be scarce in the market right now, and unreliable for that matter. Just look at what we've seen in football. I mean, how many times have you seen, Nick Saban's tested positive? the whole Alabama world's crashing down. Next thing you know, he's on the sidelines because, they were able to get more and more reliable testing. Not everybody has that opportunity. Part of it, too, is because there's a lot of divergences of opinion on the best way to manage it, the best way to monitor it, the best way to respond to it. And, at the end of the day, schools like Indiana, conferences like the Big Ten that are, primarily comprised of some world-class research institutions, they have a whole lot more resources and opportunities available to them to put together a plan and to execute it. Indiana, at least from a campus standpoint, they're processing their own results right now in their own labs. They've repurposed some of the scientific labs now for COVID testing or for processing of COVID tests. They've been able to secure and remain well supplied in order to make that happen. And like I said earlier, while that's phenomenal, that often comes at the expense of the communities where they operate, because that's certainly not something that's available right now broadly across southern Indiana, specifically here in Bloomington. And I would imagine that's a similar situation as you look across the college landscape. There are towns, there are schools that just don't have the access or the availability of some of those testing and resources. So it's one of the things that's been tremendously frustrating, nationwide across this pandemic, is we still aren't at a point here, at the end of October, rounding into November now, where that's even available. And at the end of the day, that's the primary uncertainty that gives administrators pause, is because there's just so many unknowns, not the least of which, who on this roster that we're inviting into our gym is healthy enough to play. And until you can answer that baseline question, you cannot responsibly sanction and host these events. So, I hate to see it that way. It's not fair. It's not equitable to anybody. There's been a lot of people, there's going to be a lot of athletes that kind of get left out in the dark just because of where they're at and what's available to them. But, quite honestly, that's no different than any of us in the public right now, depending on where we're at either, and how that disrupts our lives. So unfortunately, this is kind of those intersections of reality versus the college sports universe. And, in the event that you cannot get at least those agreed upon terms and protocols established against your opponents, I really don't think it's worth doing. I think one of the biggest reasons that basketball particularly is struggling with this, because the way that the system's baked in right now, the way that contracts are structured, on wins, totals, all the incentives that are in there, you've got to give them some clarity, from a tournament selection standpoint. What's that going to look like? Because honestly, how are you expected to build a schedule if you don't even know what the metrics are going to be that determine whether or not you get an invite into the tournament? Contractually at the local level, how do you replace a 20-win threshold bonus in COVID times? And quite honestly, with all the deficits these departments are running, should we even be paying bonuses? Period. When there's still no certainty that we're going to resume, in person, at least fans in the coming season. So there's just so much swirling around right now. I think you've got to find a piece of solid ground that's going to be stable underneath you, and you've really got to establish your feet and just try to weather the storm as best you can. And if you're a team like Indiana, if you're a conference like the Big Ten, it may well be the easiest, the safest way just to say, you know what, we tried our best. It just doesn't make sense to try to bring in all these non-conference opponents and all these different venues under all these different contractual terms, and risk that, if somebody gets it, next thing you know, you got a Wisconsin situation where your entire backcourt is now quarantining for 3 weeks. And how the hell are you supposed to play a game of basketball when you don't have any guards available?
Chronic, it's been far too long since we had you on podcast on the Brink, but I can't let you go without asking this. It's a user submitted question, but I think it's a very important topic that you address. It's from Daniel Carell. I believe he's an IU grad. He asks, can Chronic tell the kids these days about the legend of Tijan and how he's doing these days? So I think we need that update, and then we can get out of here.
This is probably my biggest failure ever in my role as an IU online whatever, is I cannot tell you what in the world Tijan is doing right now. I know he's married. Last I heard, he was working up in Indianapolis. I really don't know. I'm Facebook friends with Tijan, but I don't know that I've been on Facebook in a couple of months. So I'm going to have to do some digging to find out at least where he's at. He remains my white whale. I need to do a Chronic cocktail hour with Tijan at some point, or my life will never be fulfilled. the legend of Tijan is born sometime, a decade ago, about when my whole thing online was really starting. Again, IU was in a really weird place. It was a really strange time, and the internet was a weird and strange place at the time as well. And at the intersection of that, you got this guy in a liger, this mythical cat that keeps my neighborhood safe and secure and takes care of all my leftover breadsticks. No, Tijan's honestly, as much as we joke about it, he's one of the cooler stories I think you'll ever hear in IU basketball. The most improbable journey to get here, the most improbable team to join. And while he didn't, see a whole lot of success in his time here, somebody had to be a warm body to run those practices. Somebody had to take some of those minutes on the floor. And, you look at all those guys, and I don't know that folks will ever really appreciate how important they were in getting IU out of that dark period to whatever came afterwards, the number one rankings, and the seasons to follow, the watch shot moments and everything that came from there, pair of Big Ten championships. It's not just Tijan, it's the Kyle Tabors, it's the Corey Barnetts, so many players that under any other normal circumstance would never, ever have a chance to put on the candy stripes. But they answered the bell, and they absolutely got their teeth kicked in for a couple of seasons. But they enabled guys like Jordan Hulls and Christian Watford and Derek Elston to really flourish and to allow Indiana to come back to a place where, we can fill the gym again and feel mostly good about what's happening there, the outcomes that it's producing and the way in which they're going about doing it. Because for all the grief Tom Crean's caught over the years, one thing I will say is, you're looking at an Indiana basketball program that's been pretty clean when it comes to an infraction standpoint, pretty clean when it comes to a player conduct standpoint. And that's one of the things that you're supposed to care about the most as an IU fan, is doing it the right way. And we've had a lot of kids that have put a lot of stuff on the table in order to make Indiana what it is now and put it in the position where, hopefully we are returning to regular tournament appearances. Hopefully we're returning to regular Big Ten championship contention. And none of that happens without Tijan Joe and Bawa Minoru for that matter.
Follow him on Twitter at Chronic Hoosier, always entertaining. Chronic, as I said, it's been too long. We'll have to do this again at some point. If and when, it better be when the season starts, for my sake and for all of those who write about the team for a living. Thanks for the time today, and we'll talk to you again soon. And everybody will be back again in a couple weeks with another edition of Podcast on the Brink.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com, and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.